Hi everybody, Jennifer Ashley Tepper here, theater historian, author, and writer of Broadway World's Broadway Deep Dive column. I am here today at the amazing Library of the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center to show you some of the caricatures at Sardi's that would have been up around the time of the new movie Blue Moon. I recently saw Blue Moon and it is so good. You have to go to theaters, you have to see this film. It is an essential piece of musical theater history, and even for people who don't love musicals like I love musicals, it's such a good film. So here we are today with an exclusive look at some of the caricatures in the library's archives that would have been hanging up at Sardi's around the time of the movie. Sardi's has been a centerpiece of the theater community for over a century. In 1921, Italian immigrants Vincent and Eugenia Sardi opened a restaurant on 44th Street. It became the hotbed of theater activity, with everyone from chorus kids to stars to audience members enjoying food and drink at Sardi's before or after seeing a show. A few years later, Abraham Erlanger bought the land that Sardi's sat on, and so Sardi's was going to have to close and be demolished. But the Schuberts loved Sardi's so much that they gave the restaurant a spot in their new building just a little bit east on 44th Street. That is where Sardi's has been ever since. When Vincent Sardi went to a restaurant called Zelli's in France, he was amazed by all of the caricatures on the wall, and he decided that Sardi's would also have a wall of caricatures. The fun thing about that is that every single caricature on the walls, including the ones that we're looking at today, was of a celebrity that actually broke bread at Sardi's. Nobody ever got a Sardi's caricature who wasn't actually there, part of the history and part of the community. Alex Gard drew most of the caricatures we're going to be looking at today that would have been around during Larry Hart's time, and the other artists over the years were John Mackey, Don Bevan, and Richard Baratz. The first caricature that we're going to look at is Texas Guinan. Have you ever heard of her? Have you heard of her tagline, "Hello, suckers"? So Texas Guinan was an actress turned entrepreneur turned proprietress of nightclubs. She got her start on the Broadway stage where allegedly she accidentally shot herself with a gun on stage during her premiere performance. Wow. Then she was actually indicted in a weight loss scam when ads said that she lost 70 pounds, but it was found to not be true. So she spent some time in Hollywood, came back to New York, and during Prohibition, she became queen of the nightclubs. Larry Hart definitely would have known Texas Guinan and patronized several of the clubs that she was a hostess at. She was on stage, she was off stage, and even in Larry Hart and Richard Rodgers' 1926 musical, Peggy Ann, they wrote an homage to Texas Guinan. You can hear that song. It's a great Hart and Rodgers song. On her Sardi's caricature, Texas Guinan wrote, "The queen of the nightclubs, but don't ask to see my royal highness." Sono Osato holds a really special place in theater history. She was an American of Japanese descent who actually originated the role of Ivy in the musical On the Town. But did you know that in addition to that, she starred in the musical One Touch of Venus and shared the stage with Teddy Hart, Lorenz Hart's brother? Teddy Hart actually was an actor on stage and screen, and he and Lorenz Hart spent quite a bit of time together, so Larry Hart would have spent time with Sono Osato as well. She also was the first American, first ballerina of Japanese descent, and youngest to be part of the most famous ballet company in the world in the 1930s. Douglas Fairbanks was known as the king of Hollywood during the silent movie era. He, along with his then-wife Mary Pickford, were two of the first to put their hands and feet in the cement at Grauman's Chinese Theater. He also was one of the founders of that theater, and he hosted the very first Academy Awards. Larry Hart definitely would have been familiar with his performances as Zorro, as Robin Hood, and for a time, he really was the reigning king of Hollywood. Even though Otto Harbach is technically a generation older than Larry Hart, they really were contemporaries. Because they were writing musicals at the same time and working with a lot of the same people, they spent time around each other on Broadway. In fact, Otto Harbach was one of Oscar Hammerstein's mentors, and Otto Harbach really pushed the art form forward in terms of integrating the elements of musical theater. You might know his song today, "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes," but he also had quite a few hit musicals that did revolutionary things. One of these was The Cat and the Fiddle, which played a hit run during the Great Depression and which integrated all elements of a musical in an unprecedented way. Also, at one point, a musical was announced that was going to have a book by Otto Harbach and Maxwell Anderson and a score by Rodgers and Hart, but this never materialized because it wasn't an actual announcement, it was just gossip overheard at Sardi's. Patricia Bowman was the first prima ballerina at Radio City Music Hall when it opened in 1932. She was also the first to play Glinda in the stage adaptation of the movie of The Wizard of Oz, a role that she played several times. Even though it was after Larry Hart passed away, Patricia Bowman was one of the stars of On Your Toes in several productions, which was a 1930s Rodgers and Hart musical that thankfully was revived several times. People who know the name Mark Hellinger today often know it because what is now the Times Square Church was actually a Broadway theater from 1949 to 1989 that was named after Mark Hellinger. But in his time, he was a Broadway columnist whose beat included Rodgers and Hart, and then later he was a very successful film producer in Hollywood. Sadly, Mark Hellinger passed away at the age of 44, even younger than Larry Hart, but he did have a Broadway theater in his name for several years after that. Most people wouldn't think that Larry Hart and Helen Keller would intersect in the same story, but Larry Hart and Richard Rodgers' first professional song on Broadway was in a show called A Lonely Romeo in 1919. Now, 1919 was the year of the historic Actors' Equity Strike that basically established equity as we know it today. And at the same time, Helen Keller, who was then 39 years old, was part of a movie called Deliverance that told the story of her life and also starred Annie Sullivan as well as the rest of the Keller family. This movie was supposed to premiere at the Lyric Theater on Broadway, and Helen Keller was going to make a speech and be part of an event at the film's opening. But when she found out that the Lyric Theater sided with the managers during the Actors' Equity Strike, she called it off and she said that she wanted to stand with the actors and support them in fighting for their rights. So Larry Hart and Richard Rodgers and Helen Keller were both around during the 1919 Actors' Equity Strike. Alfred Drake holds a very special place in Rodgers and Hart and Rodgers and Hammerstein history because he originated roles in musicals by both teams. People might remember that Alfred Drake was the original Curly in Oklahoma in 1943, but before that, he actually originated a role in Babes in Arms by Rodgers and Hart, and he sang the title song in that show. I love that he was discovered and put in that show because an agent was in the audience when he went on as an understudy in a musical before that. Alfred Drake went on to become one of Broadway's premier leading men. He was the highest paid actor on Broadway for a time. Sadly, he didn't get to originate the roles in movies that he originated on stage, so we mostly know him from cast albums today. But in addition to Curly and his role in Babes in Arms, he also was the original lead in Kiss Me Kate and Kismet, the latter which won him a Tony Award. This caricature is of Ed Sullivan, and I love that on it he wrote, "Merry Christmas, Vincent, Ed Sullivan," Vincent being Vincent Sardi's, the original owner of Sardi's. While sadly the Ed Sullivan Show didn't premiere until after Larry Hart was gone, Larry Hart's songs were featured on it many times over the years. At one point in 1952, when The King and I was running on Broadway, Yul Brynner and Richard Rodgers shared the stage at the Ed Sullivan Show, and Yul Brynner asked Richard Rodgers about how he felt about his two big collaborators. Richard Rodgers talked about Larry Hart and his having collaborated with him for 24 years, and at that exact moment, someone pushed on the curtain behind them. I'd like to think that that was Larry's ghost saying hi to Ed Sullivan and everybody watching his show. Dorothy Kilgallen was an important journalist whose work included her Broadway column, The Voice of Broadway. In addition to that, she was dating the actor Richard Kalmar at the time that he appeared in Rodgers and Hart's musical Too Many Girls, starring Desi Arnaz. On opening night, Richard Kalmar was distracted by his date, Dorothy Kilgallen, in the audience, and so he messed up several of Larry Hart's lyrics by accident, saying that he wanted to dance and kiss men. So Larry Hart definitely would have thought Dorothy Kilgallen was responsible for that. She also wrote about him in her column, and in addition to writing about Broadway, she wrote about JFK's assassination, many other things of national importance. She also had the 1950s version of diss track exchange with Frank Sinatra, who she was friends with, became frenemies with. Basically, she loomed large in the Broadway and entertainment scene for many decades.